Hello and welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. My name is Tony Groves, and today we're aiming to get a look under the bonnet of the body politic, especially when it relates to housing. As always, I'm joined by my co-host and stable genius, is it, Martin? Is that what you call yourself?
Stable in a genius, or genius in a stable.
But more importantly, we're delighted to be joined in the Tortoise Shack by Sinn Féin TD for Dublin Mid West, Eoin Ó Broin. Eoin, as a writer, activist, is party spokesperson for housing, planning and local government, is committed to what he calls a fair recovery, Eoin, that's your...
Absolutely, yes, among other things.
Eoin was a member of the Oireachtas Housing Committee that our previous guest, architect Mel Reynolds, spoke so highly of. Mel actually really loved the report and was one of a handful of people who I imagine actually read it.
Yes.
With Irish politics undergoing so much generational change, people like Eoin working in bipartisan groups can help bring on this fair recovery. You're also a keen GAA fan, I note.
I am, yeah. I'm a season ticket. Both myself and my partner Lynn Boylan are season ticket holders for the Dublin hurlers and footballers. So
yeah, same here in this household. All right.
So we spend the cold late winter months touring around the country, which I have to say is such a great way to see Ireland and of course to support your county.
And if I don't make it, my dad kills me. If he says, what do you mean you're not going to a miserable Westport? You know.
Well, what a lot of people don't realise is like. I have no problem with the fair weather fans. I think it's brilliant that as you come into the championship, we get the 40, 50, 60, 80,000 at Croke Park. But there's a real camaraderie among the people who go to those, you know, whether it's O'Byrne and Walsh Cup and then the leagues. And you get to know people. So like folks from all over Dublin who I would never have come across 5 years, 6 years into your season ticket, you know them, you see how they're getting on, you see how their kids are doing. Do you mean it's not just about the football and the hurling, although that's, you know, the primary reason you're there, but there is something really nice about that community, which I think the folks who only come to the big games really miss. I'm not begrudging them; they're more than welcome to come to those games. But the season ticket, and the one thing I'll say is people begrudge the GAA all the time. Those season tickets are such good value, particularly if you have kids. They're a relatively small amount of money. You get all your league games and your first provincial for free. You know, you're guaranteed the rest of your tickets throughout the year.
Once you use the tickets,
60%, and you're guaranteed an All Ireland final. So you're saving money, you're contributing to the association, and you're getting your All Ireland ticket if your county reaches the final as a reward for your loyalty.
On the flip side, I will leave it is if you can't get a Dublin season ticket for Loving Our Money, I'm very lucky to have them. Having them is a great.
But there's a reason for that, which is we all have them because we had them before this latest winning streak. And when Dublin were losing, we were the ones going to the games. I understand why people now desperately want a season ticket, but the folks that have them today are the folks that were there on the terraces.
So you heard that bandwagon jumpers.
No, and again, can I say, I don't begrudge it. I want those people to come to the big games. But I suppose the reason why we have them, and the reason why it's not luck, it's because we were there before.
I suppose, it is. You worked out, but then again, you could always just become a senator and say you're entitled to one and start a row over it. You know what I mean?
here's the really interesting thing, right? So, the GAA is a smart organisation, and it understands that there's funding and there's policy, and you need to influence politicians. So, any TD or senator that wants to go to any GAA game right up until the semi-final can get a ticket, right? And they usually don't have to pay for them. The All Ireland final is different. So, TDs are able to buy, if TDs from qualifying counties can buy final tickets, right? And it's the GAA being smart, realising these are people of influence. I think the fact that senators don't have that option is a reflection of the fact that senators don't really have much power in our institutions, and the GAA realises that maybe those tickets are better off going somewhere else. But the TDs who do get the tickets for the final do pay for them, although they do get tickets available for free up until that point.
Oh, well. I'm going to change the subject and I'm going to jump right back in with housing. We've been doing this series on housing. We've had Mel, we've had Lorcan, we've had
Rory Hearn,
we've had
Mary McAuliffe.
Mary gave us a great historical context to it. I just cannot sum it up really quick. We should be building houses at 190 grand each to solve both the private and the social housing market. Rents out of control, prices out of control, and we're heading into territory where there simply is no way out of this for people who are not on the property ladder as it goes. Eoin, you were on the Housing Committee. Why aren't they just building the houses at 190k each instead of handing billions to private landlords through HAP?
So I suppose a little bit of context, just so people understand where I come from. We have a crisis in every bit of our housing system. Social housing, private rental housing, affordable housing, traveller accommodation, housing for older people, student accommodation. So every bit of the system is broken. And it's not just broken since the crash of 2008. The crisis has been evolving for about 30 years. And it's important that you get that historic perspective to it, because if we're going to come up with the solutions, and many of us think there are solutions out there that are credible, you have to have a sense of how deep this problem is. At the core of the crises across all of those sections of our housing system is a very, very simple failure of the state to play its appropriate role in our housing system. So the state can't run all aspects of housing. Very, very few people think it should do that. But our state, particularly since the mid-1980s, has taken a decision to withdraw from playing a key role. And the problem about that is it's not just folks languishing on local authority housing waiting lists for a decade or more that lose out from that. We all lose out from the state failing in that responsibility. Now, you mentioned about house building, and this is really a very fundamental point. If Dublin City Council today builds a house on any of its land, anywhere in Dublin, the average cost of that 2 or 3 bedroom house is about 189,000, 190,000. For a 1 bedroom or 2 bedroom, it could be a little bit less. For 4 bedroom, it's a little bit higher. It doesn't matter where it builds it. That's the cost. That's made up of the build cost, which is about 140, 150, some site servicing cost, and a few other bits and pieces. For a private developer on private land to do exactly the same thing, no difference in terms of the house.
Yeah.
They have a bunch of additional costs. The single biggest additional cost is land. So they have to buy land, which is often at speculatively inflated prices, and that would average out, according to the Institute of Chartered Surveyors of Ireland, at about an additional 70 grand onto that house. If you're out in Dunleary or some of the more affluent parts, it could be 90 grand per house or more.
I think the average is about 65. I think Mel
said,
if you were lucky to get something back at 35, but 35 doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly. So, first of all, automatically you have 60, 70, 80, 90 grand on top of the price of the house. It's also more expensive for private developers to access finance, because they don't just get bank finance, they have to get this 30% portion, which they call mezzanine finance, which is high risk and very expensive. That can add another 20 grand onto the cost of your house. You've also then got not the builder's profit, because the builder's profit is worked into that original 150. Okay. You have the developer's profit, which again can be another 20, 30, 40,000 depending on the price of the house. You then have obviously development levies, which is the contribution back to the state for the privilege of using the roads and the public lighting and the public infrastructure, and that's reasonable enough. You have VAT, etc., etc. So, on the one hand, the local authority built house, you're looking at 190,000. The very same house, but built by the private sector on private land, is coming in over 330,000. And it's just important people to get that. And the bulk of the reason for that is, yes, there are taxes on the private house that aren't on the public house, but there's also the speculative cost and profits of the land speculator and the developer and the banks and the mezzanine finance people. So you don't need to be a mathematical genius to realise, okay, so we want to provide an adequate supply of social housing for people on council lists, and if we want to provide an equally adequate supply of affordable housing for working people and families who are on incomes above the local authority threshold for social housing,
your guard, your nurse,
or a combined income at the upper end of 60, 70, 80,000, then the logical thing is for the state to build those houses on public land and to sell them on either at cost price or even at a little bit above cost price. So we're sitting here in Ballymun. Some people might like to call this Glasnevin.
Yeah. The Glasnevin part of Ballymun.
Just up the road.
Yeah.
You have a project on public land with private finance from the banks, coordinated by a not-for-profit housing association in cooperation with the local community. They are building really, really good quality 2 and 3 bedroom houses, and they're selling them today, and our families who bought them recently, at the bottom end 170 and at the top end 225,000. And there's no subsidy in that, in the sense that this is not only a good way to provide housing for working families, it's also much more cost effective. The builders are still making their little bit of profit and they're able to reinvest that in their company, and that's all fine, but it's good for Ballymun because it keeps people with decent incomes living in the area that they want to be living in, contributing to the local economy. It's good for the state because those people aren't getting themselves into all sorts of mortgage difficulties or having to pay all of their wages into servicing a mortgage and therefore not able to spend in the local economy. And it's good for them. So the maths of this add up, the social benefits of this add up. The difficulty, of course, is not just this government, but Fianna Fáil before them and before, but do not want to do this. And the reason is very simple. They are convinced, wrongly, but are convinced that the private sector does this better. And therefore, if you look at the recent social housing figures, the government's output for social housing for 2017, 76% of what they're calling social housing solutions provided last year are private rental properties rented and subsidised by the state, and there is no affordable housing that was delivered last year anywhere bar a project in Ballymun that the department wasn't involved in, and to be truthfully honest with Dublin City Council, wouldn't have done it if it were not for pressure from the local community and progressive politicians on the ground.
And it was an interesting point on because I know when we dug down into the statistics, I saw you're part of a conversation thread as well that went on online, that it was 1,058 was the number that they actually claimed was it, and the question that as I asked myself, I said every house that's built needs a building energy rating certificate. There's none for a lot of these properties. So the idea is, are they actually can we even trust the 1,058? My answer is no. In a few months we'll get the actual figure, and we'll drill down, and it'll be probably in the next quarter this year.
And Lorcan made a lot of this. That the first thing you need to do is establish the data, the proper data, and I don't get why Fine Gael at the moment are trying to hide or disguise what's going on. You can't solve a problem if you can't measure the problem. I mean, they're not measuring the problem as it exists. They're trying constantly to minimise it. But that's not good. That doesn't either make good political sense, it doesn't make any type of sense whatsoever. Face up to the problem and then deal with the problem.
Look, I put in a parliamentary question last week asking the Minister, I just wanted to know, at the end of every year, from 2010 to 2017, the total number of real social housing units in the state. And when I talk about real social housing units, they have to be owned either by a local authority or an approved housing body. And what I wanted to be able to see every year from 2010 to 2017, the stock. Because I want to see, is it going up?
Yeah, what's the trend?
How much, etc. Because that's the real measure. I got the reply back yesterday from Minister Murphy. First of all, they've no figures for 2016 or 2017. Second of all, the figures from 2015 backwards only relate to local authorities. And there is nobody in the department centrally keeping a record of the total number of approved housing body social houses. So, first of all, the department cannot tell us today or yesterday or this day last year how many real social houses we have. Problem number one. Problem number two is they cannot tell us, and they have no methodology for counting, the total number of new houses being produced each year. They have a couple of metrics like, ESB energy connections, and I'm sure Mel and Lorcan went through all that before. But the real issue is, if you look at the most recent reply from the Minister, they have yet to decide a methodology for counting.
Yeah.
So, and if you go across a whole range of other areas, like take homelessness, for example. So, fortunately, a bunch of years ago, they would only do a proper homeless count every 3 years, bizarrely enough. They now do it every month, so that's something much better. But the crucial thing is, if you look at the homeless figures, they are only people in emergency accommodation funded by the Department of Housing.
Yes.
We have adults and children, predominantly women, but also some men, who've had to flee their homes because of domestic violence, and they are in a separate emergency accommodation funded by TUSLA. They are not in the Department of Housing's homeless figures. We have a very significant number of families who went through the direct provision asylum system, have got their leave to remain. Some of them are now actually working, but they are spending up to 2 years trapped in direct provision because of the crisis in the private rental market, unable to get out, and essentially using direct provision as emergency accommodation. So they're homeless in the same way as the families in the TUSLA accommodation or the Department of Housing. So on homelessness, we don't know the real figures. And again, I could list you a whole bunch of other areas. So it's not just in one set of housing stats. We have a real problem in this state of providing accurate data, accurate information. And you're right, if you don't know the scale of the problem, if you don't know exactly where the problem is located, then of course some of your solutions are going to be a problem. The only thing I say is that's not our biggest difficulty. That is a real problem. The difficulty is when we start talking about numbers and facts and figures, the average person switches off. Our real problem is actually the targets that the government have set are far, far too low, and the over-reliance on the private sector as a mechanism for delivering social housing, affordable housing, and until the introduction of hubs, emergency accommodation, is at the very, very core of our housing system crisis. And I suppose for me, I'm a geek, I like the housing stats debate, but actually the really important debate is, even if they're meeting these targets, And they might. Let's say when we get the figures in a month or two, maybe they did actually produce 6,000 real social houses between building, buying and refurbishing long-term vacant council units. But even if it's 6,000, like this year we needed 12,000.
Well, Tony was talking about redundancy. There's a redundancy in the property market.
You lose 4,000 or 5,000 houses a year fall out of use by just like houses don't live forever. That's just
so
the
you're
reality.
Not really keeping abreast of the situation with that type of numbers. You're not. And there was a stat, and it was Mel, that there's 214 people families or people become homeless every week, and yet I think it's something like 11 are solutions.
There's 11 solutions.
So this is like a huge black pit that's just growing bigger and bigger.
And like the language is really important, because when Simon Coveney was minister, they kept talking about social housing. So they would say, let's say 2016, I might not have the exact figure right, but let's say they were saying with 18,000 social housing tenancies delivered. And we said, no, you didn't. Right? Because a social housing tenancy, for me, is real social housing. You get a tenancy in a property owned by an approved housing body or a local authority.
Yeah.
So we argued, and in the end he conceded the point, and they changed the language. So they're now, exactly as you said, Tony, social housing solutions. Right?
Yeah.
But if you think about it this way, 19,000 of the 25,000 social housing solutions Minister Murphy is claiming they delivered in 2017, 19,000 of them are the housing assistance payment. So you're in a 2-year tenancy in the private rental sector. Maybe that landlord will renew for another 2 years, maybe they won't. If they don't, you then have to move, you have to take the kids out of the school, you have to leave the local GAA or soccer club. It's not good for you as the tenant, and it's not good for the community in which you're living in terms of stability and security. So that's not social housing. Now, we need to be straight about this. We need a housing benefit for people who today can't get access to real social housing and who are unable to afford, whether because they're on social welfare or they're working on a low wage, cannot afford private rental. Housing benefit, a subsidy by the state, is necessary. The issue is HAP is being presented as a long-term social housing solution. And the difficulty is, by the end of Rebuilding Ireland, the government's current plan up to 2021, if they achieve what they're planning, we will have at the end of that period the largest number of people in private rental subsidised by the state accommodation in the history of the state. And the state's view will be, to be honest, that's where they're going to stay. Maybe if they're lucky they'll get a HAP transfer or a RAS transfer, but you're talking about a minimum of 90,000. And that's on the basis that by that stage nobody's on rent supplement anymore. We've about 30,000 households on rent supplement at the minute. My guess is, in fact, not only will you have 90,000 households on HAP and the rental accommodation scheme, a 4-year lease arrangement with a private landlord, but you'll still have people on rent supplement as well. And then they have this other tricky thing which they do, which is they have a thing called the Social Housing Current Expenditure Programme, which is a nice mouthful, so call it SHEP. And SHEP, of course, is exactly the same as HAP and RAS, except the property is leased for 10 years or more.
Yeah.
Now, okay, you get a bit more security, but it's still a private market house. Right, and it still has the potential of, well, what happens in 10 years? Or what happens if the landlord decides to sell up midway through that lease agreement? So if you were to add RAS, HAP, SHEP and rent supplement, could you be looking by 2021, if the government get their way, of 110, 120, 130,000 households in permanent subsidised rental accommodation, costing us, at that point in time, somewhere between 750 million and $1 billion every year. Now, you can't just take all that money out of that and put it into building.
Yeah.
So we need to be realistic. But the policy objective should be to, over time, reduce the number of people in subsidised private rental and increase the number of people either in affordable homes and or in social homes.
The simple math on this is, and let's talk about it. If you want to, you have to keep the patient alive, as Mel put it to us. So HAP was a good way of, but morphine's only good as a painkiller while you're actually treating them back to health. But if we're going to keep people on morphine for the rest of their lives, it's not going to, it's not a good system.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was actually pointed out very well was that the fact that we're currently sitting in a state that can borrow at negative interest rates, and we can do that to repay Denmark 400 million, which is fine. It saves the state money, and we know what it'll do in 2020. We all have to get there to be a panacea. But in the meantime, the average HAP repayment is €825 a month, and we could actually build and pay a mortgage for a home for less than 800 a month on 191,000 a year for that. So financially and economically, but never mind socially, which you're tearing up the fabric of society of 120,000 families or whatever. Leaving that aside, financially, it's a crazy situation.
So, one of the reasons I think, because people then often go to the question, so if we're all right about this, if we're such mathematical geniuses and we understand the numbers so well, why aren't all the well-paid people in the Department of Housing and Department of Finance agreeing with us? I think there are some reasons why. It's not that they're disagreeing with us, but they're making a different judgment. And the first judgment is they're not just looking at the cost now. If you have a large stock of public housing, whether it's social housing or affordable housing for working folks, there's a longer term cost to that in terms of the cyclical maintenance of the property, because they're all going to need new windows in 20 or 30 years and new rewiring, etc. So they're also looking at that longer term cost. There's also the issue of how much can you spend today. So of course the advantage, according to the Department of Finance, is yes, Tony, your maths stand up, but that wouldn't require us to have a far greater level of capital investment today, and we don't feel that that's the right decision, or we can't access that money, or that would breach the EU's fiscal rules.
Then the GDP ratio.
Yeah, or probably more the expenditure rules.
Exactly,
So we're choosing not to do that at this point in time. Right? So they would say all of that. I suppose what I would say is, in addition to the maths, in addition to the impact of the families in those 120,000 subsidised properties, you need to look at a couple of other things. We have about 340,000 rental tenancies in the state at the moment, officially registered. If you take the unofficial ones, there's more. If up to a third of those, 25% to 33%, are subsidised by the state, that has a number of implications for everybody else. So the first thing is, because the state is setting a rent, it pushes up the floor of rental prices. So it artificially sustains rental prices at a certain point. That's bad for the person who rents. So myself and my partner Lynn, we rent. We're happy to rent at the moment. We might buy in the future, we might not. So people like us are negatively affected by that. On top of that, it crowds out other groups of people who could be living in the private rental sector. So young people who are saving for a deposit, who can't get access to private rental at the minute because it's so expensive. Students in certain types of situations because there isn't adequate student accommodation. Or people who are at transitional moments in their life, like you've just arrived in a new town, a new city, you've got a job, you haven't decided what you want to do, and for a couple of years you might want that little bit of flexibility. So I often hear people who aren't eligible for social housing kind of saying, but why are you talking about all of this? What about the rest of us? And one of the things I always say to them is, you need to understand that the failure of the state to provide social housing affects you in all sorts of negative ways as well. This has an impact on the system as a whole, which we need to address.
Oh, and in the past, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael did actually build adequate amounts of social housing and made it a priority at the worst of times when there was genuinely no money in the country, not a cent. Housing stock at one stage peaked at 18%, and now it's down as low as 8%. That's the shortfall. That's why there is a housing crisis at the moment. So, A, why has it changed? And B, what solutions do you have to get us out of this mess?
Probably the most significant moment in the history of social housing was that decision by, and I think it was a Fine Gael Labour government, to introduce the old surrender grant. And it was somewhere around 1984, 1985. Because what that did was two things. It signalled that the state was withdrawing from the direct provision of a significant volume of social housing. It gave an opportunity to people who had better incomes and more stable employment in working class communities to leave and to move into private housing estates. And as a result, and this is a terrible technical term, but it kind of residualised social housing estates in certain areas, which meant that increasingly social housing estates were places where people with no jobs or very, very low paid jobs lived. And that was the real turning point for me. It's not that the state before that built adequate social housing, but they built a hell of a lot more. Like in the 70s, they were building about 5,000 units a year. In the 50s, the 40s and 50s, primarily thanks to the interwar inter-party coalition that involved progressive left-wing parties like Clan Republic and others, they were building about 5,000 real units a year. You're absolutely right about the figures, and I suppose for me this is the first solution. The first solution has to be that the state says our objective is to make sure that up to, say, 30% of our housing stock is public. And
I'm using, big number, yeah.
I'm using the word public, not social, and explain why. And the reason why we need about 30% is to go back to this idea of housing as a system. And if it's totally market driven, then as we know with the market, there are booms and there are busts, and that's the nature of the market cycle. So you need a large buffer of non-market housing so that when the next crash happens, you can stabilise the system with the non-market element of it. So I have this figure in my head of around 30% because
to absorb the shock.
It gives you sufficient kind of leverage in that housing system. That's the first thing. The solutions then are how do you get to that, and what kind of housing do you provide? So for me, the two things I would do tomorrow if I was minister is I would set out a capital investment programme that would say, okay, we're going to produce in year one 10,000 real social houses, 12,000 the following year, 14,000 the following year, and incrementally up till we had an adequate amount. If we've 99,000 households on the local authority housing waiting list at the minute, you're going to need somewhere close to that unit, which would take you a decade. But if you're producing, or 2/3 of a decade. But if you were producing that volume of units, then you would be dramatically changing the situation in terms of social housing stock. You'd be getting people off the lists, you'd be taking people who shouldn't be in the private rental sector out. That would be freeing up private rental properties either for renters or for first-time buyers. The properties would come down a little bit. So it wouldn't just be good for the people on the lists, it'd be good for the system as a whole. So that's solution one. The cost of doing that would be to about double the capital investment in social housing at a start off. You couldn't build all those units in year one.
No, clearly not.
But if you set out a kind of a timescale where between builds and acquisitions, in your first year you got the appropriate mix over the course of your first 5 years, by the end of it you'd be building them all.
Yeah.
So you'd reduce the number of acquisitions each year, and a lot of those would be properties that aren't on the open market, or they would be part of the vacant housing stock that Mel would have talked about and Lorcan would have talked about that could be brought into use. That's solution one. Solution two is change our definition of public housing. It cannot be about social housing for the unemployed or very low income working families. That is the wrong way to think about social housing. So solution two is change your definition of social housing and start building good quality, medium-sized, mixed income, mixed tenure, council-led housing estates on public land.
Direct build.
So that would mean, I'll come to direct build in a second. For the moment, no. Because today we don't have the infrastructure and we need these houses today. So that would mean, for example, if Dublin City Council or South Dublin County Council have a plot of land and they want 100 houses or 200 houses on it, you bring in your private builder, which is the current plan, you build good quality homes at 160, 180, 190,000 euros cost to the state. Completely integrated without any distinction. A portion of those houses are allocated through the social housing waiting list on differential rent. A portion are sold at an affordable price, as in the O'Coulon housing model, somewhere between 170 and 260,000 euros, depending on the income bracket in the area. And a portion that would be affordable rent, where you're renting them on 10 or 20-year tenancies to people just above the cost of building, financing, and maintaining the property. What that would do is it would give you a completely different kind of community. Like, it really, really annoys me when I hear people say you can't build social housing, it builds ghettos. I represent a very, very large community that lives in social housing today, and those communities, with one exception, are not ghettos. They are good quality, stable, integrated communities with people who don't work, have some work, have badly paid work, have better paid work, and they want to live there. In fact, the list of people that would die to get into those housing estates, these council housing estates, they would chew your arm off to get in. So the idea of building mixed tenure and mixed income estates is not because we don't want to go back to this mono-tenure ghetto nonsense that you hear some people say. If you go into the really good council estates today, or if you look at the good public housing estates that were built in those earlier years, they had those income mixes naturally, right? Or they developed them over time.
Yes.
So it's because I want to see really good mixed income housing estates for working class and people who would consider themselves lower middle class living in those places. So how do you do that? Alongside your capital investment programme for social housing, you also create a number of funding mechanisms to deliver in that context a serious stream of affordable housing through council-led affordable housing schemes for working families whose income is above the threshold for social housing and below a certain higher limit. That higher limit could be for a couple 80,000, 75,000, 70,000. They would be in the same estates. They would be, O'Coulon or like Marino was back in its day.
Yes.
And Combined, you would then deliver that. So in our alternative budget last year, we called for the government and we showed where you would get the finance for 2018 to build and buy 10,000 real social houses and start off with a programme of 4,500 genuinely affordable units to be sold somewhere between that, 170 to 260,000. And then you would double that the following year and add another 4.5 the next year and add another 4.5 the next year. So you would ramp up. So solution 1, double the output of real social housing. Solution 2, in parallel with that, produce a real affordable housing scheme. The other thing I would do is, I don't disagree with any of the solutions that some of your other guests have said before, because there's a lot of other things that need to be done. But there's a few bits of the picture that I think sometimes get lost. So I'm not saying these are more important, but I want to name them because they haven't been named before. We need to realise that social and public housing is not just about the bricks and mortar. It's about the people who live in those communities. And we have to find mechanisms to empower people to be able to participate in the management and decision making of the communities in which they live in. So it's about putting real resources into community development, putting real resources into community participation in how their estates are managed and run, ensuring that, for example, when there are problems of antisocial behaviour or criminality or illegal dumping, so what we call that is kind of estate management or community empowerment bit. That's really important. And the other bit is we cannot lose sight of those smaller sections of the community who are always left behind, like the situation on traveller halting sites and traveller specific accommodation sites. It's awful. Even in the councils that have a better record. Likewise, people with disabilities are completely excluded from our housing system, public and private, to the greatest extent, to a large extent. So there's this other set of issues.
I'm glad you brought it up.
And they're getting lost. And it's the same with the homeless crisis. So rightly there is a big focus on family homelessness and child homelessness because it is an absolute scandal. But let's not forget there's about 300,000 individuals in the system who are what we often call our more traditional homeless, people who have other issues going on in their lives. They're not the causes of their homelessness. Homelessness is not caused by somebody's behaviour. It's caused by the failure of our housing system to meet their housing needs. But there are triggers of homelessness, and that could be mental health, it could be drug addiction, it could be violence in the home. Yeah. And those singles, as we call them, cannot be lost either. So it's almost like we talk about the big picture, we talk about those big items. Let's not lose sight of these people who are always forgotten as well.
I think we could sum that up that you're not really into building houses, you're into building communities.
Yeah. Absolutely, and one of the things, I lived in England for a long time, and Britain did have a good record at one point of public housing. But what was different is if you went into a local authority in Britain pre-Thatcher and Blair, nobody in that department thought housing was about bricks and mortar. They thought it was about communities. We have to kind of get back to that idea of communities who live in houses, play in parks, shop in shops, and interact with each other and the state in a positive and productive way.
There's a very funny thing on that though, because we tend to be a generation behind the UK in many things, and then sadly you saw what happened this week with Carillion and the schools that are suffering, and the model of what they did is they did that to take things off books so they could borrow by saying that they outsourced things.
Oh yeah, I know.
And we're repeating that mistake.
Following the same model.
And we're following the model 10 years later, and they're reaping the whirlwind 10 years.
Here's something really important. I met, just in case your listeners think all these views are just views held by people who might describe themselves as progressive or left-wing, or I met a very senior county manager the other day discussing a project. It was a private meeting, and this guy's on the centre right, decent manager, does his job very well, I have a good relationship with him, and out of the middle of a conversation we were having, right, he said, Owen, here's my big worry. He said, we are following London. Dublin is going to become like London in our private rental sector, our social housing sector, our affordable housing sector. He said, and we're just blindly going down that track. This is a guy at the front line of government policy, delivering what the government is doing, and he's confirming to me that what many of us have been arguing about for quite some time is happening and needs to stop. That's bad, but it's also good because it shows there are public servants who aren't necessarily in our ideological space, but who realise what's going on.
But it's an economic thing, yeah.
But if they're solutions oriented, it's the same. Germany is taking cities in Germany are buying back their electricity grids, things like that, things that we've been doing for a decade. They're actually saying that's not the way it's working. We need to reverse tack there, and we'll try more of this. So the answer to hyper capitalism isn't mega hyper capitalism, right? It's maybe an actual free market with proper regulation, with an actual proper safety net for helping people up, and
I would go further than that. There's an English writer I like, and he played a bit of a role in advising Corbyn's campaign at an early stage, and he's written this great book called The Courageous State.
Yeah.
He said, what we need is the state to understand its role in all of these things. So look, we live in a capitalist economic system. Many of us would like to try and think through and imagine what a post-capitalist system looks like and try and advocate to that. But today, this is where we are. So given that's where we are, what we need the state to say is, okay, so what is our function? And in fact, I think we need to go beyond that idea of safety nets. I think safety nets are really important.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But safety nets is the old residual form of social housing where you're only looking after those with no or very low paid jobs.
Yes.
The state has to be more courageous. It has to be more ambitious, not in some controlling, 1984 way, but to understand its role. And again, I go back to the point I made at the start. If housing is a system, and if one of the reasons why it's so out of control is because too much of that system is dominated by the market, the state has to step in, identify very clearly and with a clear democratic mandate from the people, say, this is the bit of the housing system that is our responsibility. And we're not only going to do this because it's good for the people who live in this, but actually everybody will benefit because it will stabilise the system overall. And you can make the same arguments in health and education, etc., etc. So I like that idea of the courageous state intervening in the interest, in the first instance, of those people who it's working with, but the interest of society as a whole as well.
That brings me on to a really good point, because I saw this week there was a little bit of a spat between yourselves and the Irish Times.
Yeah.
And there was an interesting tweet where people said, about being a party of government or whatever was the phraseology, and then you came back and said, no, we want to aspire to better than that. Now, two things. One, I thought it was quite nice to see politicians and journalists having an argument rather than actually hand in glove and the relationship where we saw Dennis Naughton tweeting out how delighted he was that the head of INM was now going to the EU to teach us about fake news.
Having said that, the guy's an expert in fake news, so we better to teach us about it.
But I just listen, the irony wasn't lost on us at all.
No.
But about that, so that's kind of an interesting. You use the word courageous, and we want to talk about having more ambition than just being a party of government. You're right. We do need to think that way, but we also need to go and understand. We need to build that in a way that you can bring people with you, and we need to turn that model. There is a generational change going on in politics, and no more so in Fine Gael last year and Sinn Féin over the next few months. Do you think that we should be more optimistic with that, or do you think that it's actually been undersold in the media?
It's a tough question. Look, I've been a full-time Sinn Féin activist for 22 years.
Right.
11 years in the north and the rest of it back down south where I'm originally from. And I suppose I'm one of these people who I'm realistic enough to understand the limitations of the world we live in, but I get up every day and I keep doing this stuff, so clearly I have a lot of optimism to work me through all of that. And I think there are lots of opportunities in front of us, and I think there are lots of challenges. So one of the opportunities is there was a time when 80% of the voters in this state voted for Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. Right, and that's not that long ago.
No, it's not.
70% in the 2007 election voted for Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and the PDs, which are essentially a combination of the two. So there is a growth of people who want something different. It's not just generational. Like, I do meet older people and I meet middle-aged people who 5 or 10 years ago I wouldn't have said this, but when I talk to them today, they are hungry for something different. And I think the failure of all of us who are on the non-Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, pro-austerity, pro-neoliberalism, pro-the status quo space is, whether you're Sinn Féin or the Social Democrats or the People Before Profit or Solidarity or Progressive Independence, we have yet to work out how to convince a sufficient number of people that the change that they want, we can deliver it with them. And I think that's the big challenge. So we beat ourselves up that our proposals are better than yours, your proposals are better than ours. Okay, that's fine, but meanwhile there's growing numbers of people out there who are hungry for real change, and that should be our focus. We have a generation change going on inside the party. We're about to change our party leader, our party president in a couple of weeks' time. And
did the CV go in?
Not mine. Definitely not. It's funny, people ask you that question. It's like, never in your life have you thought that this is something you would do, but you're always very kind of flattered by it, right? Yeah. But again, we talked about GAA at the start, and politics, in my view, should be, like sport. It's a team game. There was a later development in the Irish Times Twitter spat where somebody was suggesting that there was something wrong with Sinn Féin, that high-profile people, and he meant people like me, weren't willing to put our names forward for the party leadership. And I was saying, well, maybe we're just not motivated by self-promoted party careerism, which is the norm in other political parties and not in ours. Like, not everybody can be Bernard Brogan. Not everybody can be Dermot Connolly. Philly McMahon won those All-Irelands just as much as the star players or Kieran Kilkenny did. And I think there's lots of us in the party. I'd much prefer to be Philly McMahon than Dermot Connolly or Bernard Brogan, not because they're not brilliant players. You need good defence, you need good midfield, you need a good backroom team on the side. And those of us who are really committed to change, it's not about my personal ambition, it's about I'm on this team, we want to win the All-Ireland, and who is best placed to play which position. And then when I'm given that position, I'll go in and play it to the very best of my ability and support all of the other players. That's what Jim Gavin has brought to Dublin football, and that's why we're doing so well at the minute. And in a sense,
don't tell you McKenna.
I think a political party that is serious about change actually takes a similar approach to it. It's not about.
I said something similar. That I've seen how Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael operate, and it's essentially it's fiefdoms that work together. Whereas Sinn Féin is more of a cohesive unit. Now Sinn Féin is not alone in being more of a cohesive unit. On that, how's things going in Brexit? I see Sammy Wilson was throwing stuff out of the pram today and trying to get everybody angried up again after everybody was hoping that it would calm down.
So, look, in some senses, our debate about Brexit up until recently was a kind of an abstract debate because it wasn't real.
Yeah.
Brexit is now real. The negotiations are happening and decisions are going to be made. So I think now is the time we all need to sit up and pay attention to it. I'm a huge critic of the European Union. I was the party's director of European Affairs for some years. I'm under no illusions about the way in which the European Union operates, whether it's in terms of how it enforced enormous bank bailouts on this member state, whether it's about the limitations it places on the ability of governments to implement progressive change or invest in public services. At the same time, I'm one of those people who believes fundamentally it makes no sense for a part of our country to be in and a part of our country to be out for all sorts of reasons. And therefore, there are a lot of negatives potentially down the line if we don't get this right. Look, I used to sit on committees with Sammy Wilson. I was on Belfast City Council for 4 years at the same time as him. So he's somebody I wouldn't take his public utterances too seriously. Let's not get distracted by that nonsense and let's focus on how do we ensure that on the other side of these negotiations, the interests of people north and south in the first instance are protected without falling into this idea that, isn't the European Union great and without losing our critical edge to what needs to change.
You have to stay critical about it. You have to stay hyper-critical about it.
So, I wouldn't be distracted by Sammy. It's the real negotiations between the governments that need to be our focus. And we need to ensure that when the Irish government goes into those, it is arguing in the best interest of every single person who lives on the island of Ireland to ensure whatever the deal is, it protects our interests.
And do you think Leo's doing that so far? I
think a lot of campaign work by a lot of people outside of the Dáil and inside have pushed them into a much stronger position. So I actually think, and we said this publicly at the end of last year, if they continue to do that, we will support them on it. But we need to be vigilant because I don't trust these people anymore than I think you two guys do, and we need to keep the pressure on them to do the right thing by Ireland.
Well, I think there is an Irish view that pretty much all of us are behind, whether you're Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Labour, Sinn Féin, and we all want the same thing out of Brexit.
Watch this space. The problem that's coming and that we're not really paying attention is the pressure will come from the EU back on Ireland once they stop pushing onto the Brits. And if that does happen, we have to understand where our place will be. Will Ireland be forced to accept almost being British trade deals in order to accommodate Britain outside of the EU? So we will still be in, but we will be with Britain in many regards to keep the border. Watch this space. It's not as straightforward as being bellicose and.
Well, the one thing I think we can all agree on, and I think everybody agrees, in the notion of a border across Ireland. And I know there's a border exists, but an actual border that you have to cross where somebody can check you, nobody wants it.
And also, let's not forget the Good Friday Agreement. and the crucial elements of the Good Friday Agreement, which are all Ireland, or the crucial elements of the Good Friday Agreement, which are about human rights and bills of rights, all of which could be dramatically undermined if you end up in the position of either a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit blind to those things. So it's not just about the economic impact north and south, although that's hugely crucial, or the social impact. It's also about not in any way undermining the significant progress that has been made to date in the resolution of the conflict, notwithstanding our current difficulties. And I think if we're mindful to all of those things, and I think if there is a genuine effort of people to work together in the Dáil and in the Assembly, if and when it's back up and running, I think we can mitigate a lot of this. But Tony, you're absolutely right. This isn't straightforward. A lot of this is complex and detailed. But the one thing I would say is now it's real, and now is the time for people to be attentive and alert to what's happening.
Owen, I know you're very stuck for time today, and thank you very much for coming in. We'll have to get you back on another time. We got more stuff to talk about.
Happy to come on
so
anytime.
Thank you very much for coming in, and thanks for talking to us about the series about housing. We think that's probably one of the most important things we're doing here.
Oh no, really appreciate you coming in. It's it was a few weeks in the making, and I'm glad you got you into the house, and we had a chat.
And just to say, this is a great project you guys have. Like, media diversity is really, really important, and I think this is such a great initiative because it creates a platform for different voices, for broader voices about crucial issues, and I'd like you guys to keep going, and anybody who listens, let's have more of this stuff going on around the country because it can only help our political and democratic culture.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks
for listening, folks. And again, we're not gonna go on too long, but we'll just say, given what's been going on out there, guys, just spread the word, tell your friends, get people listening. We're flattered by the feedback, we're flattered by the numbers, and we're genuinely thrilled how things are going. Thanks for listening.